Let me start by expressing the view that historians are going to take some time sorting out the legacy of the administration of George W. Bush. But I think we have to admit that our former president has left us some great lines. One that occurred to me as I was watching the historic transformation last week was the following: there is something refreshing about an election. Now, there's a certain irony here, and I wonder how many of you caught it, because the context is probably not one that President Bush would want to recall. His statement followed the surprise victory in the 2006 Palestinian elections of Hamas. Nonetheless, there was wisdom in the president's words. Elections in democratic societies are refreshing. New leaders, like new years, are opportunities to look ahead. They give us a chance to break out of cycles of behavior and outlook that have either failed or been overtaken by events. And they invite us to ask ourselves what we want to be rather than to dwell on what we've become. It's in that spirit that I'd like to approach my subject for this evening, the U.S. Turkish relationship and how it may fare in the opening years of a Barack Obama administration. There's some context here as well. Most experts would agree that U.S. Turkish relations over the past 8 years or so have been, to use a term that we've heard in other contexts recently, subprime. Both sides share some blame for that, although those who know my work know that I've criticized fairly extensively the Bush administration for leaving this relationship worse than it found it. As a new team finds its footing in Washington, there is damage to be repaired, there are opportunity costs to be recouped, there are lessons to be learned. I'm not going to be able tonight to predict whether those lessons will be learned, whether the Barack administration's stewardship of its relations with Turkey will be smarter and more successful than that of its predecessor. What I will try to do is to give you my sense of factors likely to shape the new administration's policy. And I want to put in a disclaimer here that I'm speaking entirely as an individual. I have not been asked to serve in the next administration, don't expect to, and what you're hearing is in no way a reflection of any policies they now have or may come to have in the future. Now, these factors analytically fall into two categories. I'll call them structural and conjunctural. Structural factors are about institutions and dynamics. They change slowly. When they change at all, they're not really affected much by whether the president's named Bush or Clinton or Obama. Conjunctural is just a big word to describe the things that Turkish and American leaders are going to have to deal with in the months and weeks ahead. You can as easily call them the agenda or the issues. So I'll take the structural factors first. And the first and most basic thing to remember, not just about U.S.-Turkish relations, but about our relations with any country, or for that matter, any nation's relations with any other nation, is that politics is local. Politicians are in the business of getting elected. Things that don't directly affect their prospects at the polls, unless they're truly existential, will inevitably have second claim on their attention and their energy. What is Barack Obama's priority? You know the answer. It's the economy. Period. The president has named a stellar foreign policy team. Thank you. And is clearly himself a natural at foreign affairs. But history and the American people will judge Barack Obama in 2012 primarily by how well or badly he has handled the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. What's the implication for Turkey? There has always been a tendency in American diplomacy for crises of the moment to crowd out the development of long-term relationships. The urgent trumps the important. And Turkey, as a country that by and large has been for decades more an asset than a problem for U.S. policy, has inevitably suffered as a result of this phenomenon. Given the magnitude of the economic and other tasks facing this president and his team, and despite what I'm sure will be their best intentions, it will be a challenge to ensure that Turkey receives the timely, senior-level attention it merits as a country that, more than most, can help or hurt this new administration in its first steps abroad. Which gets to a second structural factor, and to my mind, the enduring bedrock of America's modern relationship with Turkey, Turkey's unparalleled location. Because Turkey has for the past half-century or so been so stable and predictable an ally, some here have occasionally lost sight of the importance to America of where Turkey sits. The first years of the 21st century ought to have put paid to that misconception. The Obama administration comes into office with recent clear reminders that Turkey is a place you need to get over or you need to get through to help Georgia or to support or withdraw forces in Iraq or to develop alternative supply routes to Afghanistan. It's a place you can't do without to nudge Russia onto a more constructive path or to build a coherent strategy towards Iran or Syria. It's a unique nexus in terms of energy security strategy or combating the spread of weapons of mass destruction or organized crime. There may be places in the world as important to the United States on one or a few issues that we really care about, but I can't think of a place as important on so wide and overlapping a set of issues. And experience tells us that when we need to use or to transit Turkey's geography, we're almost always in a hurry. It will happen again. And this provides a corrective to my point on local politics. Turkey may not today be at the top of the to-do list of Barack Obama and his foreign policy team, but life and geography will get it on their screen in due course. And when it does, they will find, as have their predecessors, that it is always easier to work with Turkey than to work around Turkey. It's a matter of physics. So where Turkey sits is important. But there's another reason that Turkey will find its way onto the new administration's screen sooner rather than later. Turkey cannot be overlooked because of what it is. It is, first of all, big in landmass, in population, in its economy. In addition, Turkey's Ottoman legacy gives it unique standing among and arguably understanding of some players who figure prominently among the Obama administration's top foreign policy challenges and priorities. Thus, the prominent role Ankara has come to play recently as a mediator among Israelis and Syrians, Syrians and Lebanese, Armenians and Azeris, Russians and Georgians, Iraqi Sunni and Shia Arabs, Iran and the world, and lately, Israelis, Palestinians, and Egyptians. That's really important in terms of U.S. interests because, of course, Turkey also happens to be a functioning democracy, a member of NATO and the OECD, a candidate for EU membership, an active participant each year at Davos, till perhaps last night, a poster child for the IMF and the World Bank, and a newly elected member of the United Nations Security Council. It belongs to some really good clubs. And it's 99% Muslim. And since September 2001, like it or not, coming to terms with Islam in its many forms has been a core problem for American foreign policy. In one way or another, it will remain so for a generation or more. Now, the United States may not have done a particularly good job of engaging the Muslim world since 2001, and I commend the organizers of this conference as a step towards correcting that. Some would argue Turkey is a prime example of how we've done it badly. But what is indisputable is that in our post-9/11 world, the very existence of a country like Turkey is an important fact, one that demonstrates in concrete terms that there is no fundamental contradiction between Islam and the West, between Islam and globalization, between Islam and parliamentary democracy, between Islam and free markets. Call it a model, call it an example. If you want to make some Turks unhappy, do either. Call it what you will. Seen from Washington, Turkey's success serves fundamental American interests. And reports that Turkey is being considered as the site of an early speech by the President on America and Islam, if true, suggest that the Obama team understands this at some level. Those of you who follow these things may have noted that I've not yet mentioned a factor usually cited at the outset by those seeking to convince audiences that all is well in U.S. Turkish relations. The notion that our bilateral ties are rooted in common values and interests. That's a term of art for those of you who may not be aware. And there's a reason for that. The fact is that the proposition is simply harder to make today than it's been in the past. Let me make myself clear on that point. At the level of interests, I continue to believe, I'm convinced, that there is a basic correspondence in terms of what each country wants to see happen in the region around Turkey and more broadly. It's when you get into the question of how to achieve those ends that there's room for doubt as to whether we are really on the same page in terms of how we view our interests. And perversely, Turkey's more self-confident foreign policy under its current government has sometimes reinforced such doubts, even as it has enhanced Turkey's potential value to the United States as a strategic partner. I'll have a bit more to say about that later. At the level of values, we need to acknowledge tonight that both sides' images in recent years have suffered in the eyes of the other. In Turkey, that was a function of a long series of missteps by the Bush administration, perhaps the most important of which was an unexplainable, years-long delay in taking effective action against PKK Kurdish terror from northern Iraq. The result was the famous polling data of a few years ago showing U.S. approval ratings in the single digits, lowest in the world. In the United States, meanwhile, perceptions of Turkey have been shaken in recent years by episodes suggesting that important elements in Turkish society do not fundamentally share the values of liberal democracy that make the West the West. This isn't the place to dissect the accuracy or inaccuracy of perceptions on either side. I only want to point out that while in the past, incoming administrations, Turkish or American, could point without risk of serious contradiction to the existence of a broad commonality of values and interests as reason for confidence that the relationship would be okay, the Obama administration may have to think twice before trying to make that case. I'm going to conclude my review of structural factors by returning to U.S. domestic politics, where the existence of single-issue interest groups hostile to Turkey has for decades been a feature and an irritant in our bilateral relations. The good news is that for a variety of reasons we can get into afterwards if anyone wants to, our new administration, unlike its predecessors, may get a pass from the Greek lobby. The bad news is that the Armenian lobby is fully mobilized, highly motivated, and in possession of unprecedentedly clear and unqualified commitments from leading members of the new administration that the events of 1915 will be termed genocide. It's not clear when the genocide issue will come to the fore or whether the venue will be the White House or Congress. But there is a very real prospect that this highly charged question could be a formative experience for Turkey with the new administration. And that's a good place to transition to the second set of factors that I think will affect U.S.-Turkish relations, what I call conjunctural factors. What are the issues in the months and weeks ahead that will give U.S. and Turkish leaders the opportunity to take one another's measure? And what are the prospects that these initial exchanges will go well? I'm going to start with the crisis of the moment, in true Washington style. Israel's military operation in Gaza and its aftermath. It's a good place to start because it will highlight some concerns I expressed a moment ago. I don't need to get into a discussion of whether Israel's actions have been right or wrong to note that Turkey's response to the crisis shows at once the potential advantages and risks from a U.S. perspective of the AKP government's more activist regional diplomacy. On the one hand, Turkey appears to, behind the scenes, have been an active, creative, and constructive contributor to negotiations that brought about a ceasefire, an important contribution. On the other hand, what have to be termed the rhetorical excesses of Prime Minister Erdogan and other Turkish political leaders have undermined Ankara's hard-earned reputation in Israel, Washington, Europe, and even some Arab countries for even-handedness. It has to be said that the Prime Minister's public remarks have been restrained compared to those both of his rivals and political supporters, many of whom have called for wholesale dismantling of an Israeli-Turkish relationship that has served both countries well for many years. But his words have clearly had an impact on Israeli perceptions of Turkey's impartiality, even before last night. And I'm confident that that will have to be taken into account by the Obama administration as it considers how and with whom to begin the process of re-engagement in pursuit of a lasting peace between Israel and its neighbors. The kind of tensions I've just described could also affect the extent to which the new administration and Turkey are able to work together on what I think is Washington's most pressing strategic challenge: what to do about Iran. The good news is that Obama and his team seem committed to shifting U.S. policy in a direction Turkey has long advocated. We will engage Iran diplomatically. We will seek to engage. We will be creative in seeking to devise inducements for the Iranian leadership to adopt a more constructive approach. All this will be music to Turkish ears. More problematic will be Washington's likely argument that to maximize prospects for successful diplomacy, Iran will need to see that the international community is more united than in the past in its willingness to impose a penalty for intransigence. In a word, more sanctions, sooner or later. Now, the starting point for building international consensus on new sanctions has traditionally been the UN Security Council. What this means for Turkey as a new member of that body is that it will find it hard to argue, as it has in the past, that its position on sanctions will conform to some ill-defined notion of international legitimacy, another term of art. As a UN Security Council member since January, Turkey will participate in the making of international legitimacy. There will be no place to hide, and any gaps between its approach and that of the Obama administration will stand out in stark relief. I would note in passing that in that context, Turkey's on-again, off-again pursuit of investments in Iran's energy sector are also likely to require a higher and likely more problematic profile in the months ahead. And I'll use that reference to energy as a transition to a more encouraging subject: energy. For those like myself who participated in the highly effective cooperation between Turkey and the United States on strategic energy diplomacy in the 90s, the past 8 years have been a tragic lost opportunity. And we're seeing the results of that loss today in stories of shivering Bulgarians and panicky West Europeans and worried Turks. The hour is late, but Russia's test of wills with Ukraine this winter could be the impetus for a renewed commitment by the United States, Turkey, and Europe to overcome the petty and self-interested squabbling that has frustrated rapid movement on the Nabucco and other projects essential to the long-term energy security of the West. And that could return strategic partnership on energy issues to a prominent place on the U.S.-Turkish bilateral agenda. Another area where time and opportunity has been wasted in recent years is Europe. Here, too, there's plenty of room for finger-pointing, but here, too, the time may be right to move beyond that. Developments in Turkey over the past few years have demonstrated the risks to American and European interest in allowing Turkey's EU candidacy to drift. And Washington, in my view, could have no higher priority in its policy toward Turkey than to revive Turkey's prospects for EU membership, recognizing that it's ultimately an EU decision. To a lot of Americans, that's counterintuitive. But this is why I say it. The irreducible U.S. interest in Turkey is that this unique, strategically located country not fail. And a Turkey that is a member of the EU, or is on the path to becoming a member of the EU, is a Turkey that simply cannot fail. It's that simple. And that's why we need to support it. Then there is Russia, an area where the Obama administration has signaled a more nuanced approach and where vital Turkish and American interests have traditionally intersected. I fear that President Obama's national security team is going to find that Turkish-Russian relations are not where they left them in 2000. Turkey's trade relations with Russia have mushroomed in recent years to a volume roughly 3 times that of trade between the U.S. and Turkey. Despite efforts to diversify, Turkey remains overly dependent on Russian energy imports, and a quick review of foreign policy developments in recent years will show that Turkish and Russian positions on issues like Iran, Iraq, Palestine, and Black Sea security have converged. Now, I know a little bit about Russian history, and I know that Turkey and Russia have a lot of history, most of it bad. I'm not among those who believe Moscow will ever provide an alternative to strategic partnership with Washington or the West generally for Turkey. But as the Obama administration re-engages on issues like energy security or the security and independence of former Soviet territories like Georgia or Ukraine, it will need to understand that it cannot count on Ankara simply following the U.S. lead, as might have been the case in the past. Now, you'll have noticed that I've been speaking for a long time and have barely referred to Iraq, on which the U.S. Turkish partnership foundered badly in 2003 and 2004. And the reason for that is that, by and large, my sense is that the two sides today are largely on the same page as regards Iraq and are likely to remain there. There will certainly be challenges, but I see no evidence that the Obama administration's approach in Iraq will jeopardize Turkish interests there. And from Washington's perspective, Turkey's constructive diplomacy toward and in Iraq and its contributions to its neighbors' economic revitalization cannot help but be seen as added value. I believe Washington will also see Turkey as an important part of the solution as it refocuses American resources on Afghanistan. A final conjunctural factor I want to mention is Turkey's internal politics. Now, there are good reasons why democracies, as a general rule, try hard, as do former ambassadors, not to become involved in or even to comment on the politics of other friendly democratic countries. Excuse me. That said, there are many in the United States, including in the new administration, who believe that failure to speak out more clearly on such developments as Turkey's 2007 and 2008 constitutional crises risked outcomes that Washington would by no means have welcomed. It's also the case that Democratic administrations have more often been inclined than Republican to comment on internal developments in Turkey, particularly with respect to human rights, freedom of expression, and the rule of law. There's a lot going on in Turkey today. Much of it is obscure to outside observers. It is not clear where it will lead or whose interests will ultimately be served. But as events take their course, it may be that for the first time in years, Turkey's internal situation may be something Washington feels compelled to raise in private and to talk about in public. I've covered a lot of territory. I hope you will have taken from what I've said that there is some hard work ahead for both the Obama and the Erdogan administrations to get U.S.-Turkish relations out of the doldrums of the past few years. Our 2008 elections were about change, but changing presidents doesn't mean U.S.-Turkish relations will automatically reset to the great days of 1999. Turkey, the United States, the world have changed in important ways since then. There are pitfalls and snares ahead that will trip up the unwary. Getting Turkey right, to borrow a phrase from my friend Suat, will require focused, sustained, hands-on management at the highest levels of an Obama administration that takes office with a very full inbox. The last 8 years are a cautionary tale in the consequences of not making the necessary investment beginning day one. We're on day 10. Maybe we can begin to draw conclusions, but in any case, I'll be happy to take questions, but I think first there'll be a comment. Okay? Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much for a very comprehensive and very thoughtful, I thought, presentation on what might lay ahead. And I would say that I share many of your concerns. And despite the optimism and the decision for change in the United States, there needs to be a lot of work done, both on the Turkish side and on the American side, to get this right. And last night, I think, was an indication that it's becoming even more complicated, multifaceted, and will require the good work and offices and efforts and good intentions and people who believe in the strategic partnership of the last 5 decades to make this work again. Now, not everything is gloomy, but let me provide some of my input to what Mark said. I think the biggest challenge remains, and some of you remember what before I became a politician and had a real job with a think tank in Washington. We were always telling our American friends that the real challenge in the relationship is really to help Americans to make the mental shift about what Turkey has become. And I think even today, and most of what Mark said is a testament to that it is still not fully done, namely to have Americans, especially those Americans who are in policy positions, who influence opinion in Washington, about what Turkey has become. Turkey is no longer that third world satellite country of the Cold War years. It's not only that country that used to be considered within the NATO alliance's defense of the southeast corner of NATO. It's become a more democratic, a more transparent, a more self-confident country that has a lot of influence and a growing role in its immediate neighborhood. I alluded to it earlier this morning. And I think that new role provides new tensions and problem areas in the bilateral relationship that we are not used to having. Even last night, when Prime Minister Erdogan expressed his disappointment with the Israeli operation in Gaza, he was reflecting what 71 millions of Turks were feeling about it. Yes, he was cut off by David Ignatius, and that really irritated him. But I think what was behind more of that is really the frustration with all the good work, for instance, we put into the Syria-Israel negotiations that completed the 4th round and were about to come to the 5th round. But Turkey will and continue to have a larger role in its immediate neighborhood, including the Middle East. And I think I find it regrettable that the Special Envoy for the Middle East's tour in the region does not include Ankara. I hope this was a decision done before the Davos incident. But if that's not the case, it's not really a good sign for things to come. If we manage to recognize and acknowledge the new Turkey and what it means for the region, and I agree with Mark what you said, that what we ultimately aim is very similar. And I think the objectives we have for the region are very similar, and they do coincide. But without going about it that acknowledges what Turkey is now, I'm afraid we will run into problems and important obstacles that could really poison the relationship. And I think the most immediate and urgent problem and risk for the relationship to prosper is really the Armenian resolution that is likely to come up in the next in the coming month. I have been underlying it, and to incoming delegations from the United States to Ankara as well. We have been telling them, and I think there is value in reiterating it here again. If there is going to be an Armenian resolution passed through the U.S. Congress, this will be an extremely, extremely negative input into what could be a promising period of restructuring the partnership between Turkey and the United States. Now, I think most Turks now understand very well what and how these resolutions come about and what the dynamics are behind. But we are particularly concerned because Turkey and Armenia have started an important normalization process with the visit of our president to Yerevan this summer. There have been promising signs for the establishment of diplomatic relations between Turkey and Armenia, and then the eventual opening of the border between Turkey and Armenia, which would normalize and stabilize the Caucasus for a very long time. It would be very unfortunate to see at this time, a resolution come at this time, for whatever reasons, domestic dynamics that would be. But what I'm more concerned about is, if such a resolution would be passed, it would, for good, for the next at least 4 or 5 years, ruin any possibility of Turkish-American partnership. Let me conclude with a more optimistic note. I believe, despite the difficulty in expressing common values in the relationship, I think there is still a lot of good men and women on both sides who understand the significance and the strategic importance of this relationship to such an extent that we will be able to manage, to restructure, to re-identify the Turkish-American agenda and probably work on a more cordial and productive level than that of the last 8 years. But as Mark said, it requires a lot of work. It's not something that would naturally take place. It would require a lot of work, a lot of good efforts. And even this conference, I think, by bringing a lot of Americans and Turks together, is one small, modest step in making that happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Suat Kiniklioglu, for your reflections on Mark Parris' speech. Now, I would like to open for question and answer session, and I would like to invite Mark Parris to answer those questions. By the way, the person who is asking questions, please identify yourself. Please explain your name and last name. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad that no one tried to cut Suat off. We might have. I'll take any question from the floor. There in the middle. Do you want to answer your part of the question first? The question was a request to Suat to elaborate on his statement that Turkey isn't now what it was before and what he means by that, and then a question to me on Turkish-Kurdish relations.
What I really meant by that is, in the 1970s and 80s, when there was business to be done between Turks and Americans, you had Americans flying into Ankara, hop on a cab, go to the general staff, talk to a number of generals, get business done and fly out. It was a very different Turkey than that of today. Today, public opinion matters. It's a growing, dynamic country that has a lot more self-confidence and thinks of itself as a country that is centered at a pivotal state in a number of cross-border regions. March 2003, when the Turkish parliament refused U.S. troops to invade from Iraq from the north, was a clear example of the change in Turkey. But basically what I'm alluding to is that there is a much more gravitating actor in the region than that of the 70s and 80s that many Americans are used to deal.
in terms of the Turks and the Kurds, you first got to decide which Kurds you're talking about, of course, because there are Kurds in Turkey, there are Kurds in Iraq, there are Kurds in Iran, there are Kurds in Syria, there may be Kurds elsewhere, there are Kurds here. I assume you're talking about Turkey's Kurdish citizens, and that's the first point. They are citizens of Turkey and enjoy the full panoply of rights available to any Turkish citizen, in theory. There are a lot of Kurds in Turkey who would probably challenge the premise. There are parties that exist to challenge the premise. And there's an ongoing debate of long-standing in Turkey as to exactly how the two communities should interrelate to one another, what kinds of rights the Kurdish element of the community should have in terms of education in mother tongue, broadcasting, ability to publish, those kinds of things. It's an ongoing debate. It's a very different debate than it was when I was there 10 years ago, when it was still difficult to find Kurdish language literature, Kurdish music, that sort of thing. Now, beginning in January, the Turkish national television station is broadcasting in Kurdish. The ruling party in Turkey in the last elections soundly defeated the party claiming to represent the Kurdish portion of Turkey's population in the southeastern part of the country. So it's work in progress, and it's one of the 2 or 3 issues that the Turkish Republic has been wrestling with since its foundation. And the elections that will take place in March, I would guess, would be a good test as to whether or not the current government is continuing to make inroads into some of the skepticism and antagonism that have sometimes existed in some parts of Turkey among that population. Yes?
Let me just focus that question a little bit. I didn't do it as well as I may have wanted to. But I'm just wondering, would it help ease tensions in that area if the Kurds, the various countries in the Middle East had their own independent state?
Well, I mean, that's an academic question as a practical matter. The last time it was a practical matter was in 1919, when people like Woodrow Wilson were talking about it at the end of World War I. As a former practitioner and as one who knows that neighborhood reasonably well, I can't envision any combination of circumstances that would produce that kind of result in any reasonable time frame. So, maybe, but I just don't think anybody in this room is going to see it happen. There's got to be more than one question out there in the back. I know my friends from the press here will jump in unless you help me here.
Hello. My name is Turan. My name is Turan Kayol. I'm from University of Washington. And, just thank you for such a wonderful presentation, providing such a clear picture of Turkish-American relationship, showing both the potentials, but at the same time possible pitfalls that may be on the way. My question is, I was just talking to my friend Richard Williams here, but one issue that we don't talk here is some kind of Ergenekon, and I think at the end of your talks you alluded, if I'm not mistaken, but I just want to ask you to elaborate on it, and there are lots of speculations, and I really appreciate your just comment on what it means in terms of Turkish-American relationship and how the United States is in the picture in this kind of process of Ergenekon. Thank you.
My allusion was as opaque as the subject. I will confess before this audience, I don't understand what the phenomenon called the Ergenekon investigation is about. By definition, you're talking about an investigation into something that was deeply hidden for many, many years. And I don't know. I think you've got to have Turkish DNA to even begin to understand what's going on here. I don't, to the best of my knowledge. Clearly, it is something important. It may be something historic. Being historic, being important, doesn't mean good or bad. And I think in terms of the U.S. role, if I had to guess, I would guess my colleagues at the State Department and elsewhere are watching it closely, scratching their heads, and trying to figure out exactly what it all means and where it may be leading. And to the extent that my comments were a little less sharply refined than the rest of my presentation, it's a reflection of humility, which is a popular word in Washington these days, in case you've noticed, that I think you have to bring to looking at something like this. It would be like Turks trying to figure out Watergate. It's the best analogy I can come up with, which had its own dynamic and which was a uniquely Washington phenomenon, American phenomenon. I think this is something like that, and I don't know who's behind it. I don't know who the subject matter really is, and I don't know what the stakes are for any of the parties that are involved, or even if we know who all the parties are that are involved. So I'll stop there. Sir.
Joshua, Princeton University. I wanted to start where you kind of began as well and go back to the movie because that's more interesting anyways. The Armenian Genocide Resolution, you alluded to it, which pretty much seems to be, if you look on paper, a done deal at some point. The question is when, not if. Given that as a kind of an assumption, given the short-term consequences of that, as we just heard from a Turkish representative, it's going to mean serious problems. What can we meaning the U.S. government and also U.S. society, those involved in different groups, do to kind of blunt the blow as best as possible?
Thank you. I'll try to be as clinical in this as I possibly can, because I don't want to suggest that what the Armenian community in this country is doing is illegitimate. If my grandmother had walked out of Anatolia, I might feel exactly the same way. So this isn't an attempt to be judgmental in any way. We have an example of how this can come out right, and it took place a year ago, the last time we were staring down the barrel of an Armenian resolution after the Democratic victory in the midterm elections. It didn't happen, not because the Turkish government spent millions to lobby Congress, not because American arms manufacturers spent millions to lobby Congress. It didn't happen because an issue that had belonged to the Armenian community and 30 people in Washington became an issue in which a lot of Americans in small towns and cities around the country developed an interest, and that was what happens to their kids in Iraq if we can't use Turkey to supply them. And from personal experience going on talk shows where the host would say, well, let me get this right. We're going to cut off the best, most direct, most efficient route of supplying our forces to Iraq because of something that happened nearly 100 years ago by a different government? And I said, well, that's sort of what it boils down to, yeah. So I think what occurred as a result of that discussion taking place was that members of Congress, for whom there was no cost to sign their name to a petition to bring this to a vote, suddenly had something to lose. That may happen again this time. We're still in Iraq. We're coming out of Iraq this time rather than staying in Iraq. It's still important for us to have access to Turkish geography, whether it's Iraq or whether it's the broader region. And there's a strong national security case to be made that we shouldn't do this. There's also the case that Suat just made. There's something important happening in Armenian-Turkish relations that also may be important and historic and would be good, I can say, if it were to occur, which is a normalization of relations between two neighbors whose relations historically have been problematic, Armenia and Turkey. If this resolution kills that, it will be a bad thing for everybody concerned. And it very likely would kill it, even though wiser heads would probably try to prevail. I think there is a chance that if those arguments are made well and forcefully over the months ahead, that the new leadership of the State Department and ultimately of our government will realize that whatever they may have said in the heat of a primary campaign in California, or more recently, just doesn't make sense in terms of the U.S. national interest. And it doesn't. And we'll find a way to back off this. That said, it's going to be hard because they are much more clearly on record that they will do this time. And so it'll be harder. I don't know how this will come out. I'm not optimistic. But I do think that there is a case to be made, and it needs to be made well and forcefully. Is that a question back there? The fellow who's standing? You? No? There's a question here. You let me down, all of you out there. Here comes the media.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your good insights.
Thank you.
And my question about the most popular topic in journalists. What was your reaction to the drama at Davos? And did you expect such thing? And what would be the cost of the event in Turkey's role in the Middle East, between Syria and Turkey, or in Palestine and Thank you.
Well, you know, as one who's participated in a lot of discussions, I've gotten mad at moderators too. But when I get mad, the consequences aren't necessarily quite as high as perhaps they were last night. I guess I would subsume my answer to your specific question in the remarks that I've already made. That is, I think that last night will contribute to a process that I think had begun some weeks earlier in the Prime Minister's and Turkey's more generally response to the events in Gaza. I think that prior to the events in Gaza and prior to Turkey's response, Turkey had, through a lot of hard work, creative diplomacy, commitment of a lot of diplomatic capital, genuinely done what it set out to do 5 years ago. That is, to create a privileged role based upon the trust of all the parties in the region. All the parties in the region. That's something that very few countries in the history of that conflict have managed to do. The United States is probably the only one on a sustained basis that's been able to pull it off. And it's been able to pull it off because in addition to being able to be popular in the Arab world, they also had the trust of Israel. And Turkey had achieved that. Now, I won't speak for the Israelis. I won't certainly speak for the next Israeli Prime Minister, who, after all, will be the one that decides where the relationship goes next on the Israeli side. But you can see from the things that have been written in the Israeli press, you can see from some of the statements that have been made by American Jewish leaders, that Turkey's, and more specifically the Prime Minister's words and actions of the past month, have created the impression that Turkey has taken one side. And that has to be at the expense of its long-term hopes of preserving the role that I think it had achieved as a trusted intermediary among the various parties between Israel and its Arab neighbors. I view that as a loss for Turkey. And I don't know that it's one that will be easily recoupable. I hope that it can be. And as I say, I think it would be premature to write Turkey out of the game, simply because you don't know what the definitive Israeli position is going to be on this until they've had their elections and there's a new prime minister. There may be hope of reconstituting this. I just don't know.
Long-term relationships between the American people and the Turkish people.
Well, I'd broaden it. Frankly, it's not just between those two peoples. I'd put it in terms of America and the rest of the world, and I think that's really your point as well. And I think it goes back to the question we had here a second ago on the Armenian resolution. There's a tendency inside our beltway in Washington to cast foreign policy and other issues, just look at the economic bailout package, in black and white terms, in value-loaded terms. And that's easy to do when no one's paying attention outside the beltway. as we've seen with the Armenian resolution. An informed populace who takes an interest in foreign policy and educates itself by doing things like what we're doing tonight is a populace that will be relatively immune to that kind of hijacking, I would say, of the policy process in Washington. And we'll get better governance as a result of it as Americans. So, the reason that I always come to these things when I'm given the opportunity is I really believe it, and I think it does make a difference. Thank you for the question. Going to cut me off?
No, I'm not. Please. Is there any more questions?
There's one over here.
I think we have, yeah. That's the last one.
It's the last parliamentary word, I think. Our colleague is a member of the Turkish Grand National Assembly, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is, I didn't see a very optimistic picture about the Turkish-American relations. Not very pessimistic either. But to prosper Turkish-American relationships, with your experience, what would you advise to the Turkish-American organizations that are in the United States?
Well, there are several kinds of such organizations, as you know, and they all have their roles to play. And by and large, I think they're playing them with increasing effectiveness and effect. There was a time when sort of the Turkish lobby in Washington was the null set. It didn't exist in practical terms. Turks who have come to this country, been educated here, stayed on, as many in this room have. I was told that there were 10,000 Turks in Georgia alone earlier today. Are beginning to do what other groups that have come to this country have, which is to become part of our political process. And I think that it's had an impact in places like California, in opposition to other interest groups like the Armenians, but it's also developed a positive agenda in terms of creating incentives for American politicians, policy leaders, to educate themselves, to take Turkish concerns into account at an earlier stage in the decision-making process than might otherwise have been the case. When I was ambassador to Turkey, you could count on one or two hands the number of people in Congress, Senate and House, who spent any time following Turkish issues. They were really few and far between. The Turkish caucus in America today in the House is, I think, 50 congresspersons. So that's a qualitative difference in terms of the way things get discussed. There is a Turkish study group for congressional leaders that involves both members and staff that meets regularly to discuss issues that we've been talking about in this room. So the discussion of Turkey today is an order of magnitude more sophisticated, more widespread, more effective than it was a decade ago. And so if you extrapolate that, and looking at some of the economic charts lately, you don't want to extrapolate anything, but I think that one has every likelihood of continuing to increase in terms of in both quantitative and qualitative terms. What would be the likelihood that Kennesaw State University would be having an event of this sort a decade ago? I suspect it wouldn't be very high, and here we all are.
My name is Dan Barak. I'm here at Kennesaw State. Thank you for all your remarks. Because this is the theme is Alliance of Civilizations, and from my perspective, part of what we're doing is looking at how do we move forward together, and what are the best ideas, best practices for doing that. You've kind of suggested a number of things that you think would be smart moves, in U.S. Turkish relations, such as supporting Turkish inclusion in the EU. Could you maybe just say a few more words about the kinds of things you would recommend if you were advising?
Well, I'll save you the trouble. You can go to the Brookings webpage, and I wrote a memo to President Obama last fall, which is about 6 points and involves both some changes that we would make inside our government to be more effective and more focused in our approach to Turkey, and doing things like Suat suggested a little while ago of recognizing that Turkey's not the country that we got used to during the Cold War and the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, that it is different, that it behaves differently, but not to be threatened by it. And to understand that a Turkey that is doing some of the things that it's doing today, if you engage it correctly, and if you engage it early, and if you can sort of get on the same page together, both in terms of big concept and execution, there's a win-win there just waiting to happen. I know that the people that went into the administration have read that kind of stuff. I also know that they've read a lot of other stuff, and I have no idea as to whether or not we will see it begin to show up in practice. These people have a lot on their plate, and the fact that George Mitchell has left a doubt as to whether or not he's going to Ankara. Sorry? He is going. Okay. Well, I'd want to look at the sourcing on that before I take it as a given. but assuming he goes, it means maybe they're paying attention. Thank you.